This video will be on the topic of answering some commonly asked interview questions with Salesforce. Question number 1. How do you influence customer perception? Right, and the first thing I want you to realize here is this is, to translate this interview question a little bit, how do you influence your customer perception in a positive way to add value for them ultimately, right? So they're not asking you for a time when you corner the customer into a deal by any means, right? So to be clear. Furthermore, this question of how do you influence customer perception makes sense both for subject matter experts as well as for sales roles. You know, for sales roles, it's pretty much obvious that you're going to talk about the sales funnel, or you know how you influence them, how you made them realize that there's value to whatever you are selling them at some point in time, right? For example, some people prefer to say they run workshops or develop and present options based on technology and feasibility trade-offs in order to meet the customer's objectives, right? This would be one way you could go around this. Or another way, someone pitched this to me in a coaching session, was that in order to influence, to get buy-in from their company to switch from Citrix to Skype, they basically pitched this to their top 10 executives, and they simply asked them to use it in their internal meetings for a period of 3 months. And since those executives got on board, this is how they ultimately influenced internal customers' perception, and then drove adoption for that Skype in this context, right? So notice here the keyword, the key would be rather to gain their trust. Okay, question number 2. If there's one thing you'd wish you'd improve on, what would it be? Okay, so this is to translate this interview question, what's your weakness? Okay, so it's as simple as that, the moment you understand what they're actually asking you with this question. I've recently coached someone for a pretty executive role, for a director level role with a well-known company, and they happened to also be a certified coach. So they were someone who knew what they were doing in the job interviews. And when I went when I asked them this question, what's your weakness, they basically talked about how they tend to have a broad vision for the objectives in their company, whereas, you know, the main requirement was rather to focus on one thing and do it well, right? So basically what they were doing was that they were turning a positive into a negative, because there's no such thing as if you have a vision that's a weakness you have, but rather something you would ultimately want to sell yourself on, right? But long story short, they were turning a positive into a negative. And I want to explain that this scenario, in my opinion, is not the best use case. Probably, you know, it used to work a number of years ago. It was a classic thing, you know. But nowadays, the expectations, at least in my experience, have been always been to talk about a genuine weakness you have, right? So for a salesperson, it could be you don't know how to code. Okay, for a developer, you could say public speaking. You know, I mean, it's the same weakness for the last decade or so, and it's not very much about the weakness as much as it is around pitching that with a great story, right? And back to my coaching with that director, she had a great story to back that up. So it was a good answer, but still I would not go turning a positive into a negative. I'd rather pick something which is more genuine for the weakness story. Number 3, tell me about the cross-functional collaboration. Okay, so how do you work with people from different backgrounds, with different subject matter expertise? This is what cross-functional means, and what value can you bring in these scenarios, right? So the number one problem that I see with this, with people's answers to this interview question is that they are broad, they are vague, they are generic, and they do not contain any metrics. People tend to talk how they would deal with a cross-functional collaboration when compared to an example of when they actually did this, right? So for instance, cross-functional collaboration would be when you manage the team cross-functionally. For a technical PM, for instance, that you could talk about different project management approaches, such as the agile or other project management techniques, and how you implemented those techniques, and ultimately, had some outcomes for those encounters. For sales roles, it's obvious that you're working maybe both with customers, but also with your internal stakeholders. Some salespeople also work with technical roles as well, so it shouldn't be a problem finding examples to the moment you realize you know what you're looking for. That is a specific example talking about how you bring value working with people from different backgrounds, right? So this would be cross-functional collaboration. Next one, number 4. What's your worst failure? Okay, so this would be this question is on the same lines with what's your weakness. Some people tend to say, I never fail, I only learn, right? Or some other people tend to go something on the lines of, well, we all have failures, and I think the key to get back from a failure is to get its learning and then move on. And I had plenty of failures in my career, but I always got up, learned things eventually the hard way, and then I moved on, right? So the problem with these examples is that they're vague. You're not talking about a specific situation of a time when you actually failed. Now, on the opposite spectrum would be when you talk about the failure which got you fired from your last role 3 months ago. Okay, so that would be a bit dangerous if you're going for a new role, simply because the definition of a behavioral interview is that they look at your past experiences in order to predict your future performance on the job, right? Whereas if your most recent experience was failure, you must bring in some very interesting learnings to the table to make that failure worth talking about in a job interview, right? But the key point would be this, that it takes people many tries, many attempts to find the proper failure in the first place. And the other thing would be to spend as much as half of your answer talking about the learnings. And it will take you around the same amount of time to find your learnings from that failure, the same amount as it took you to brainstorm for the failure in the first place, right? So focus on the learnings, and that these are the best types of answers I've heard. Right. Next question. Tell me about the time when you sold your ideas to key stakeholders and C-level executives. Right. So we've had such a question previously. How do you influence customer perception? How do you influence stakeholders or C-level executives? Essentially the same thing. Depends who's your customer. Okay, but the key word that I mentioned then, and I will mention it again right now, would be trust. Okay, so working with others, working in teams, even cross-functionally, we also want to answer the question. Trust is key. How do you build trust in these circumstances? You may also remember the example which I gave you with convincing people to switch from Citrix to Skype, their internal meetings. It's also the approach that person used was to sell this idea to key stakeholders, that is the VPs or senior executives in that bank. It was a bank, a well-known US bank in that example. And if you sell that idea to them, they could trial Skype for a period of 3 months, and then eventually there's enough trust to have a wider adoption for Skype in that example. It's a pretty old example, but I believe it's a very interesting, it's a very memorable one because of the approach that the person used to build trust and to influence various stakeholders, right? So in questions surrounding the personal skills, trust is a key element you'd want to sell yourself on. Okay. Next question. Tell me about the time when you took something which was outside your area of responsibility, but which was critically important to your business. Right? So something which was not necessarily your cup of tea, but you still went on and got it done because you thought it was important for the overall business. Now, these things, this question means very different things for different roles, right? So a customer support person would talk about time when they got something done for a customer which wasn't their area of, wasn't as if they were, it was mandatory for them, but they thought it would be a good value to bring further value for the customer. Could be same for a salesperson. Like they thought they would improve something for the customer. It would go on the different type of example, for more technical types of roles, and maybe, you saw some super feature or some code which was not good enough to get into production, and you jumped in to add those few extra steps, made you worked longer hours to achieve this. But the key reason why someone would ask you such a question in a job interview would be to see if you exhibit ownership. Okay, so ownership is an essential component of great employees. And one mistake, it's not a critical mistake, but one mistake that people do in these circumstances, they cannot think of a specific enough example of a time when they took something which was not directed of interest, and they give either vague examples, how they would deal with such a situation when compared to a time when they actually dealt with one, or they talk about obvious stuff, like they noticed a bug into production code and they thought they'd fix it before releasing it, as if they had a choice. Okay, so these things are normal things. You don't go above and beyond to achieve this stuff. Long story short, ownership. Think about times when you exhibited ownership in your role, and basically you don't have to answer the question ad literam, but if you think it's a great ownership story, that's what they're looking for. Answer what they're actually looking for. That is the behavior, not just the question that they're interested in. I should say first the behavior and then the question that they're interested in, right? Next question. A time when you reviewed and course corrected a project program direction, approach, and key artifacts to keep programs on track and solutions extendable and maintainable going forward. Okay, so a time when you course corrected something. So another way this question gets formulated, it's quite a common question in job interviews, would be a time when you're 75% through a project and realize something had to change to ensure its successful completion. Okay, on a time when you had a challenging delivery. Delivery means very different things to different types of roles, right? For salespeople, delivery on your sales target. For developers, delivering on some code. For some PMs, delivering on some projects or programs. These type of things. But long story short, the way that the question is framed is counterintuitive for most to read a bit through the lines, that they are interested in your ability to deliver here in challenging circumstances. So what's the most challenging scenario in which you had to deliver here? And one mistake you'd want to avoid is you'd want to talk about projects or programs related to your direct area of expertise, right? So for example, if you're a developer, a challenging delivery could be that one of your colleagues got stuck, right? So this would show on your interpersonal skills, your willingness to help others, right? Which is great. You have interpersonal skills, that's fine. But that's not selling yourself as a great developer, subject matter expertise for the role, right? So my point is, if you're talking about the challenging delivery for a developer, then that's a time when you made a difference with your subject matter expertise, not your interpersonal skills in this context, right? Could go for a manager level role when you help the colleague, to get back on track and deliver successfully, because for manager level roles, interpersonal skills will be key, right? But think about what's your subject matter expertise and what is challenging delivery to your specific scenario, and then you'll be able to find the best possible example to talk about that, right? Next one, a time when you enhanced internal processes and methodologies based on recurring customer feedback and evolving industry standards. Okay, so why would someone ask you this question in a job interview? They would want to understand what do you mean by high standards. Okay, so it's no secret that different businesses have different standards, different levels of standards. So if you say you have great customer support in company X, this might mean that you have decent customer support with regards to company Y, because they have their level, they're one notch up. Okay, so basically think about what is high quality, what is high standards for your own role. Okay, so for salespeople, you should over deliver on your sales targets. You should think about, hey, what makes the difference what is one story that could sell myself as the most amazing candidate, knowing that simply reaching sales targets is probably not a good enough example. So time when you did something differently and eventually boomed sales as a result, the time when you had a long-term approach to a sales funnel, you invented a sales funnel, you adjusted the sales funnel, these sort of examples. Needless to say, for more technical types of roles, again, high standards. This you would have to really dive deep into your experiences and think about what's the best example that you can bring from your professional career when you exhibited high standards. It's not extremely difficult to bring to find these examples. It's just that if you do it before the interview, you'll ensure that you'll have a few more brain cycles. You're a few brain cycles ahead of the people who did not prepare for such interview questions. Next one, why Salesforce? Okay, and there is this trend in the past several years or so that everyone is over-complimenting these companies, that you're an amazing company with amazing people, and so on and so forth. Whereas, if you're an interviewer, if you put in your interviewer shoes and you hear these compliments 10 times a day, you will essentially have no chance of differentiating candidates for these job interviews. So needless to say, you have to come up with something that is more peculiar, right? To give an extreme example, why do you want to join Salesforce? Well, I don't know that I want to join Salesforce as of yet. I'm here to learn more about the opportunity and to see if we can have a mutually beneficial relationship. Okay, so to the extent your CV allows to exempt, you're applying for the type of roles for which you would be comfortable putting the problem this way. But nevertheless, this is an approach which did work even for software engineers in other companies. Okay, so why Salesforce? Think about something interesting, something peculiar, and ideally something memorable. Okay, this would be, I'm trying to give you some memorable examples, which I've heard, to give you some pointers as to how could your answers improve for the purpose of interviewing with them. You could also link to their values, to their ohanas as well. Not many people read them, but it would be something interesting for you to consider as well, right? And finally, tell me about the time when you had a major disagreement with your boss. Okay, so main thing is to understand why the question gets asked. And believe it or not, this question is on the same lines with a time when you had a cross-functional collaboration, a time when you influenced an outcome, customer perception, the first question, which I demoed in this video. It's about your interpersonal skills. Okay, so the reason why these questions are so efficient is because unprepared candidates tend to be slightly argumentative with these things, and it's a lot easier than many of you think to put the blame on someone, such as your boss or your colleague or even your company, for you not being able to progress in your previous role, or you could also go with some baseless examples, such as you had a major disagreement with your boss. When your boss was wrong, you were right, but you still agreed with them and they were wrong, and then they found out, hey, yes, it's wrong, and they should have done as you said, right? Which would basically wouldn't sell you on anything as a great candidate, but would rather be complaining that your boss wasn't listening to you during your previous role, right? So the examples you'd want to showcase here would be to sell you as a candidate, as someone whose interpersonal skills are developed enough to handle disagreements in a corporate environment, where things might get tense at times. It could be as well a time when you disagreed with your boss because you were right and you proved them, you showed the data. If you were a director, you maybe commissioned some research study that proved with data that, hey, the idea wasn't the best course of action, and eventually convince the other person, hey, this is not the best course of action, right? Or maybe a time you had a disagreement with your boss when you disagreed with them, but they proved to be right ultimately. This could also be a perfectly valid example you could bring in a job interview. What you want to stay away from, again, argumentative and putting the blame on others in job interviews, because believe me, this does happen more often than you think. Right, this was my 10 questions I wanted to demo you for this video. I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.